Welcome back to Andrew's Night Talk. Today's topic is the World Economic Illusion. May 2022, US Federal Reserve initiated the biggest rate hike in 22 years to ease inflation pressure and claimed the strong US economy will be able to adapt the tightening monetary policy, despite of the first quarter GDP recorded 1.4% decline a few days ago. As usual, the propaganda machine peddled the same lie as they did before, but now even the mainstream media began to abandon the previous narrative about the inflation pressure being transitory. So what is the truth and how to understand the real problem of the current economy? Let's have a look at the world economic illusion. Economics, as one of the most complicated topics in social science, was taken granted by so-called economists as a fortune-telling business. The traditional economic theory of supply and demand, along with the monetary policy and fiscal policy carried out by the government to make adjustment in real economy, remains unchallenged. Unfortunately, as modern civilization evolves, the old principles are no longer valid, but people are still using the traditional statistical data indicators to carry out economic analysis. Therefore, mistakes were repeated to create bigger and bigger problems. To understand the world economic illusion, we must think outside the box and realize that GDP and CPI are no longer the economic indicators to reflect reality, and the law of supply and demand was being manipulated in modern society. The problem with the GDP calculation is the currency standard. Each country uses their own currency to measure GDP growth, but the fluctuation of the exchange rates are making it extremely unreliable. The current global standard of recession was defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, but each country does not lock in the same standard currency as the real measurement. For example, Australian GDP after the global financial crisis and before the pandemic always recorded steady growth in terms of Australian dollars, which created the illusion of economic growth to support the Australian financial market. But between the year of early 2011 and early 2013, Australian dollar was very strong, and the exchange rates against the US dollar were traded above the parity level. Later on, in year 2019, Australian dollar exchange rates depreciated around 30% against the US dollar, and yet the market still believes Australia recorded positive GDP growth because it was reported in terms of Australian dollars, but the real value of wealth shrank dramatically. CPI is another example of the economic illusion today. Consumer Price Index is the economic indicator to measure inflation, but it does not include housing price, which is the most important aspect of human lives. In modern society, many people struggle to have their own house because the price increase in the past couple of decades has been phenomenal. But as the biggest expense of a lifetime, housing price was not considered as a major part of the measure for inflation. Anyone has basic knowledge of economics normally believes in the law of supply and demand. But not many people understand in modern society, everything was manipulated through perception. And that is the reason economists are acting like fortune tellers, trying to predict the future all the time. Through predictions, they can influence the outcome of pricing, but not really changing the supply and demand. There are always different variables affecting the equation of economic reality, but the new factors to make the traditional economic theory obsolete are globalization, and the climate change hoax. After the Cold War, globalization became the new trend to dominate world economy and picked up speed after China joined the World Trade Organization in year 2001. Since then, the developed countries enjoyed a long period of steady low inflation thanks to the cheap production cost in China. When the global financial crisis broke out in 2008, most developed countries dropped their interest rate to historic low levels to avoid deflation. But at this point, central banks have already lost control over the real economy, and shifting the world manufacturing hub to China set unprecedented supply chain problems for the future. With the climate change narrative spread through mainstream media, developed countries began to shift their energy supply away from fossil fuel, while ignoring the fact that climate change is inevitable throughout the history of the Earth, with or without human race. And the most ironic thing is the fact that the policymakers around the world flying in their private jets to attend summits to set up rules for the general public in order to reduce carbon emission while making sure their privilege remains unchallenged. Both globalization and the climate change agenda set the time bomb in the world economy for the catastrophe we're experiencing today. When the mainstream media lied about the inflation being transitory in America, their main purpose is to shift focus away from the real stagflation. And as the largest economy in the world, when the US economy has a problem, the world economy has a problem. And the tough years are yet to come. Central banks around the world are hiking interest rates real fast, hoping to keep the high inflation under control. But they will soon realize that monetary policy is ineffective in front of the climate change hoax. The supply chain crisis created by globalization might ease over time, but the high energy cost due to the climate change agenda will flow through every aspect of the economy because any production is dependent upon reliable energy, and the so-called green energy is neither cheap nor reliable. The only thing it will lead to is higher living costs and more poverty in the future. We're living in the economic illusion created by the narrative that was set to keep us under control. But when the real economy begins to crumble, chaos and turmoil will follow. The only way out of stagflation is to cut regulations and limit the power of government, like Ronald Reagan did back in the 1980s. But will the brainwashed population wake up to choose the right way out of this mess? Maybe only God knows the answer. I'm Andrew Hathaway. Thanks for watching.